Hey everybody, welcome to the Commander Pod, your Magic the Gathering podcast for all things Commander. I'm Spencer Simpson.
And I'm Kelton Howell. This week we are talking about building around your commander. So as you're building your deck, what considerations do you need to make based on the commander that you're building for?
Yeah, we're going to be talking about three factors today. One of them I thought was going to be a fourth, but we're kind of putting it in with the other one, right? So the three factors we're going to be talking about
just rule of three. It just makes it cleaner. It's easier to talk about if it's just three of them.
Yeah, the comedy rule of threes, the commander rule of threes. It all fits.
There you go.
Okay, so the factors we're going to be talking about today are cost, reliance, and setup. And these are all in the context of your commander. So how much your commander costs, how reliant your deck is on your commander, and how much setup your commander requires. So we're going to kick off with cost, and I think Kelton's a good one to kick us off here because he is significantly better at thinking about this and the cards he includes in his deck regarding the cost of his commander. I wish I was better at this. So Kelton, can you tell us about it a little bit?
Yeah, that's very nice of you. It is something I'm very passionate about. So some ways in which cost can affect how you build your deck. First of all, restrictive mana costs mean that you need better fixing, right? If you have more colors in your commander, your fixing just has to be better if you expect your deck to play smoothly. One example of this is the blessings of playing a mono-colored commander. I have a Shield Druid the Apocalypse deck, mono black, so I get to run a lot of colorless ramp, which is really good in black because black does not get a lot of good ramp options. So good colorless ramp like Mind Stone. I don't really love playing Mind Stone in many decks. Thought Vessel, don't really love playing Thought Vessel in many decks because that colorless mana can just create issues later. But in a monocolor deck, you just don't run into the same problem. So that's one thing. I would say the other one, though, is mana cost determine, obviously, how early you're going to be able to get your commander out. So the things to think about are what are you planning on doing on the turns leading up to that point when you can get your commander out? And then what else are you running at the same CMC slot as your commander? So if your commander costs 4 mana, what else is in your deck that costs 4 mana?
Yeah, that's the one that I'm particularly bad at, especially because I feel like a lot of commanders, especially the ones that I'm running that are 2 colors and even 3 colors, are 4 CMC. That feels like a pretty common slot at which your commander runs is 4 CMC. And there's a lot of effects that are 4 CMC, and I find myself wondering, oh, should I cast my commander right now? And I think that then comes into some of these other factors we're going to talk about, of whether you should cast your commander before any of these other cards in your deck. Yep. But we've talked about this before, and you have mentioned that you run, and I think like other places like the Command Zone, I've heard this, that you just run fewer cards at that same CMC as your commander because it puts you in fewer awkward situations where you're saying, oh, do I cast my commander or do I cast this spell? And I don't know that I've actually really felt like I've been in that situation a ton. And so I'm kind of on the fence about this one a little bit because I do feel like that's part of Magic is like you might have several spells at the same CMC, right, that you're like choosing between. And that's like somewhat inevitable, right? So do you feel like you should actively include fewer cards at the same mana value? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be saying CMC. Wizards would get mad at me.
No,
as your commander?
I sometimes do. I know. I'm trying to get better. The one I'm trying to get better at is Kindred, calling Kindred instead of Tribal. Specifically in the Shield Druid deck, I do run less 4 CMC things because I just care about getting Shield Druid out so early and trying to go as fast as possible. So let me run a scenario by you. You're playing a blue deck. It's got blue in it. Your commander costs 4 mana. Turn 1, land go. Turn 2, you ramp. Turn 3, you now have 4 mana. You could cast your commander. You have a Rhystic Study in your hand. Like what do? You want to get the Rhystic Study out as early as possible so you're starting to get value. Depending on how reliant your deck is on your commander, how synergistic it is with the commander. I know we're not talking about reliance yet. Yeah. That's a little bit later. But do you just try and jam out your commander on turn 3 since you've ramped? It's better to get your commander out early for this deck. or do you just play the Ristic Study? You know, like, so
Yeah.
you do get into some awkward situations like that occasionally, depending on how your deck is set up and where a lot of your effects fall on your curve.
Yeah, I do feel like it really depends on some of these other things we're going to talk about, like reliance and setup. For example, I don't know if it was mono blue, but if the deck just includes blue and it's 4 CMC, let's think about like Alila, Artful Provocateur,
Sure.
right? 4 CMC commander. Sure. If it's a Ristic Study and I'm playing Alila, I'm dropping Alila first, probably, right?
Totally.
Because
Yeah,
then you get that enchantment out and get a 1/1 flyer. Off of
and hopefully you
Alila.
can double spell on the next turn. If you have 5 mana, you have, Ristic Study only costs 3.
Right.
You can hopefully have another thing in your hand that you can play.
Yeah, and potentially triple spell, right? Like say the other one thing in your hand is a rock. So you Alila turn 4.
Yeah.
Turn 5, you play a land, you play a land, you rock
Ristic Study,
and
so
something else.
ahead.
Right, yeah. You've all of a sudden got 3 other flyers out. So I think it really does depend on like how reliant, it's so funny because we're only talking about cost right now, but how reliant your deck is on your commander and how much setup your commander requires. I do think like an example of this that I've been thinking about is I have a Wilhelt the Rock Cleaver deck that's a zombie tribal. Not tribal, kindred, typal. It was typal for a while.
Gotcha.
And now it's
typal
kindred.
for like 2 weeks.
Oh, they changed it? People hated typal enough?
They did it like really, really quickly. They changed it. Yeah.
That's so interesting. Okay, yes, it's a zombie kindred deck. And one of the cards that I've included it is Necroduality, which is a 4 mana value enchantment, right?
Yep.
Which only cares about on cast. And so I think in that instance, I play Necroduality first, because in the following turn, I play a Wilhelt. I get 2 copies of Wilhelt. One of them dies and becomes a decayed zombie because of Wilhelt's ability. And then I can sack that decayed zombie if I don't have any other zombies out to draw a card. So I think like I think it really does depend on what your commander does. And so I've had a really hard time convincing myself that including fewer cards at the mana value that my commander slots into is actually something that's relevant. Unless I will say the caveat for that is ramp, probably. The caveat for that for me is ramp.
Like Shieldred, like I said, I built to go very fast, and I think mono black decks do fast pretty well, which is funny because they don't have very much ramp, but they're pretty good at moving fast. And so, like, for me, it's like Shieldred is the only thing I care to play on turn 3. Like, it is the only thing I want to play. We're gonna talk about this again a little bit later. The only other consideration is like leaving up protection when you cast your commander. Like then you're that's also potentially throwing off when you're gonna end up playing your commander. So we can talk about that a little bit more later. One thing I want to talk about in terms of restrictive mana costs and fixing is this does kind of change how you build your deck, in that let's say you have a commander that costs 3 but is 3 colors, so something like Animar, you're maybe not always going to get to cast your commander on turn 3. You may not always have 3 colors of mana on turn 3. And as we were preparing for the show, you were challenging me on this. You're like, well, then just get your fixing right.
Yeah, I indeed was. And I think, and so I will say the perspective I'm coming at it from is my only current 3 CMC commander that I'm trying to get out on turn 3 or 2 is Faldorn, which isn't 3 colors. Sure. So it's significantly easier. But even so, I do think it's very possible, but mostly if you're in green, right? Because and we've talked about this. Yes, and we've talked about power level to some degree in decks, and this may be a topic for another episode. But I was like, in my Faldorn deck, I have a lot of dorks, and I have Wild Growth, and I have Utopia Sprawl, and a Lotus Petal, because I'm trying to get Faldorn out on turn 2. And our discussion's been, well, why do you want to do that? And that's maybe a different discussion. But in Faldorn, I want to get Faldorn out to try to get Wolves, and I do feel pretty consistently I may have to mulligan, but as long as I have 2 lands and a dork, that's going to happen for me. So go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think that relating it to power level is extremely relevant. So let's talk about like Animar. Even if I'm not running very many dorks, being able to fix my mana efficiently to just have 3 colors of lands on turn 3 means I'm running a very expensive mana base. It just means that I'm playing all of the best lands that are going to get me all the 3 colors that I need. You have a Garth One-Eye deck that's a 5-color deck, and your mana base is a significant portion of the budget for that deck.
Yep. Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, it runs all the fetches, all the shocks. No alpha duels because I'm not rolling in that much dough, but and again we proxy very heavily.
Yeah, it's true.
But
so I do think that is an aspect of it. Like at more casual tables, if your budget isn't running all of the shocks, all of the fetches, your mana fixing is going to be significantly worse. It's going to be harder to play more mana restrictive commanders.
yeah, that totally makes sense. And and most of your dual color mana base is going to enter tapped potentially. So unless you're playing those lands on turn 1 or 2 that give you the multiple colors, then maybe you draw it and play it turn 3 and you're like, okay, well, pass. So
Yep.
I guess the question I have then is, for me in Faldorn, for example, again, 2 colors, really likes having dorks. And I think, again, in green, it's significantly easier to do this, right? Potentially. I mean, Birds of Paradise really is the only one that's going to actually fix your mana. So I guess there's an argument to be said for that.
Depending on how many colors you are, because then there's the hierarchs, right? There's ignoble hierarch, noble hierarch.
True. Yes.
Right. There's other ways to fix your mana in green, but it does require you having other colors sometimes. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. And so I guess my follow-up question is, if you are playing a green or a non-green deck, let's say, and or even a green deck, but it's 3 colors, and you really are trying to cast your commander on turn 3, are you playing signets and talisman? Because this is part of the discussion I wanted to get into with like the cost of your commander and like what ramp you're running. Because I'm way more inclined to run signets and talisman in a deck where my commander is 4 CMC or higher, 4 mana value or higher, than I am with like a 2 mana value commander. Even though they'll still help ramp me, it's not ramping me to my commander at all.
Totally. I mean, I recently built a Malcolm and Breaches deck that it's a combo deck. It's trying to go really fast, but I play 0 ramp in the deck because so granted, this is also a budget deck. I'm not running like Crypt or anything like that really accelerates me that quickly, but I'm still trying to win on turn 4 or 5, and I don't need ramp because my commander costs 3 mana, and that's a really awkward spot to be if you're not playing really fast mana like Mana Crypt or Jeweled Lotus. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I guess, and again, by budget, we should clarify, this was a $25 budget deck.
This is like $25 budget deck.
Yeah, a very, very budget deck. So Signets and Talisman are pretty, you can fit them in decks at that price, but at the cost of other cards that you may want to include. But I would argue a 3
that it would make sense to.
Okay, that was what I was going to ask, is like, do you think the 2 CMC rocks are worthwhile running in the deck? Because you're trying to cast your commander, but you're probably not going to do it until turn 3 anyways, so why not on turn 2 play a rock and then have an extra mana on your turn?
Yeah, so for me, the reason it doesn't make sense to run it in that specific deck is it's a density thing, right? If I'm running ramp, I'm actually diluting the amount of other things that I can be running in that deck. Okay, I'm actually looking at the deck list. I forgot that I did swap in Solaring at the very last moment because I had an extra $1 worth of budget to burn, and obviously Solaring is always going to be good. But it really just cares about having a lot of interaction and then a lot of redundancy in the combo pieces. And so like, if I'm like, yeah, sure, like I'll just throw in Signet so I have extra mana later, those are just combo, like those are filling the spots of combo pieces that I'm not going to be able to draw into later that I need for that deck to win, because the deck is very glass cannony. It's like it is going to attempt to win, and if it fails, then there's a chance that it's not going to get to do that again because it doesn't have the resources to catch it back up very quickly.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like when we, if I remember when you were playing it, most of the spells in there are cantrips, and so again, if there's Soul Ring, obviously is amazing, and that gives you a turn 2 Malcolm, right? Which is really, really good and does what all of the signets and the talisman won't. The talismans. We had a discussion about this recently. Talismans.
Yeah. Talismans.
Is the plural, which I didn't know. But if you draw any of the signets or talismans later, I mean, a Soul Ring does the same thing, but is at least nets you mana from the cast. Like you have you'll gain a mana from casting Soul Ring, whereas these, you're losing mana if you cast them, and they're just, again, diluting your deck so you won't draw into another cantrip when you are trying to storm off with Malcolm Breaches. Yeah, that totally makes sense. I do think that that including signets and talismans, though, does make sense for other 3 mana value commanders, right? That aren't trying to storm off in the same way.
Yeah.
But I guess the question I would raise is, what about like your 1 mana value? Like someone builds like a Yoshimaru deck. Like, are you including and Yoshimaru partnered with something else, so obviously that's going to have a higher mana value. But I guess the point stands, right? Where you have a really low, or even a 2 mana cost or 1 mana cost commander. Are you going to be including the signets and the talismans in that deck?
Yeah, this is actually a really good opportunity to talk about something that I was wanting to talk about, and that is to think about the play patterns of the deck to help you make these kinds of decisions. So like another deck that I built recently that doesn't have very much ramp is Goldbug from the Transformer set, and that's because the play pattern looks like turn 1, play a human. Turn 2, you play Goldbug converted. Turn 3, you play a human, you attack, you draw off of Goldbug's ability, you then play your second spell, and you convert Goldbug back. And like that is the play pattern. So there's like an absurd number of 1-drop humans in that deck because like that's how the engine gets going, is like I'm almost always mulliganing until I hit a hand that allows for that play pattern. So I'd say like if you're Yoshimaru deck, think about the play pattern. Like, yeah, you're always going to be able to play Yoshimaru on turn 1 pretty much all the time. What are you trying to do after that? Like, does the ramp matter for the rest of the game plan of the deck? And I guess we'll talk about that a little later on with the Reliance and Setup as well. But yeah, think about the play pattern of your deck and try and plan out the first few turns and say like, what, like in a perfect scenario, what is this deck trying to do on the first 5-7 turns? And that can give you a clue as to what do I want to be playing on turn 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I guess the only sticking point for me is like, because we've talked about this, and there's been decks where I'm like, oh, I don't need to ramp to my commander. And you said, okay, yes, but you still want signets or talismans to be able to double spell later on. So I do think there's still like, you still want ramp in these decks, even if you're not ramping to your commander, because you're likely ramping to other things or being able to do more stuff. But it is like pretty case by case, and that's where it becomes so difficult is. But I think those are like pretty good guidelines that you have to think about how mana restrictive your commander is. If you actually need a lot of fixing, the mana value of your commander and what you were trying to do at its slot, and if you're trying to cast it as soon as possible, or you want to get some other stuff. And again, we're going to talk about Reliance and Setup in a second here, which I think are other considerations for how you're how you are evaluating the cost of your commander as well. And I think that'll actually help come into focus a little bit as we talk about these next categories. So the next one,
love it. And I do want to say,
oh yes,
even though I'm challenging you on the amount of ramp to put into your deck, I love ramp. I include so much ramp in my decks, and the majority of my decks have a lot of ramp. But what's been interesting, something that I've learned recently in deck building, is that just not every deck wants ramp. That some decks, and once again, highly dependent on power levels. At lower power level tables, where the deck is, or the game is going to be a lot longer, a lot grindier, you just may not need that much ramp, and that's okay. Just think through what is your deck trying to accomplish, and when. And what is the cost of your commander? So
yeah, absolutely,
kick us off into the next section.
Okay, awesome. The next one we're going to be talking about is reliance. So how integral your commander is to your deck functioning. So some examples of really high reliance commanders would be stuff like I built a Muldrotha deck, which Muldrotha the Gravetide lets you cast on your turn a spell of each permanent type from your graveyard, or play a card of each permanent type, so you can play lands as well. And if Muldrotha repeatedly gets removed as you're playing, it just feels really bad because you've been filling your graveyard with stuff and sometimes intentionally getting rid of things. Like you might put a Mystic Remora in there and not pay its cumulative upkeep so that you can cast it again for 1 blue on the next turn. And it gets removed and you're like, oh, well, shoot. Now what do I do? Because my Muldrotha is gone and it costs 8 mana now, right? So part of what you want to do, with really high reliance commanders, and I will say I've been trying to move away from this because it feels really, really bad to have a really high reliance commander, and especially if they're a high mana cost, get removed, and then you have to cast them again, right? Because then it can virtually shut off your deck. So some things that you would want to do if you have, especially a high mana value commander, and that is very high reliance, is you want to run a bunch of protection, right? So you want to run your Lightning Greaves, you want to run your Swiftfoot Boots, you want to run counter spells. In the case of Muldrotha, you wanted to run stuff like Kaya's Ghost Form, which was an enchantment, like a repeatable enchantment to bring Muldrotha
so good
back
in that deck.
Yeah, so disgusting, absolutely disgusting in that deck specifically, because you can cast it every turn. It's pretty mean. Like counter spells, or one you had written in here was Command Beacon, which I've not run in any decks, but is really great because now your commander's been removed twice, costs 10 mana. Oh, well, I'm going to sacrifice Command Beacon. I'm going to cast it for 6 on my turn, which is significantly better. But if your deck's not as reliant on your commander, maybe you don't run those things. I feel like for a long time in my deck building, I was saying, okay, I'm building a commander deck. Let me put in Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, Lightning Greaves, Swiftfoot Boots, right? I was like, these are all the things that go in my commander deck. And I eventually reached this point where I was
6-card commander deck.
Right. Yeah. And I reached a point where I was and those last cuts of your commander deck, like you add in like 120, 150, in the case of Kelton, like 250 cards, and you cut it down to 100 eventually. Is those last like 5 to 10 cuts can be really close, right? Like as you're cutting down like to your 100th card in your deck. And I really found that these were easy ones to kick if I didn't feel like my deck was as reliant on my commander being alive, or I had like a lower CMC commander that I was like, oh, this doesn't need to be in here as much.
Totally. I totally feel that way. And it just affects your deck so much when your deck is so reliant on the commander. And I already mentioned that I have a Shieldred deck. The deck does practically nothing without Shieldred. In fact, the deck actively hurts you if you don't have Shieldred because you're running things like Teferi's Puzzle Box and like a lot of wheel effects, and those, if you're not benefiting from them asymmetrically, then you could just be benefiting your opponents more. You're going to be actively behind. So Shieldred is what makes the difference. Shieldred is the one netting you a positive and netting them a negative. And so I run a lot of protection in that deck. That's actually one thing that I hadn't really been thinking about until we started the discussion. In a mono black deck, protection looks much different than any deck that has blue in it, because counter spells can serve a dual purpose in blue decks, that they can protect your game plan and they can stop someone else's game plan. Whereas the kind of protection that I'm running in Shieldred is stuff like Supernatural Stamina, Undying Malice, Feigned Death, Kaya's Ghost Form, like you mentioned. I even consider to some degree like Animate Dead. Those are all cards that are going to help me get my commander back or protect my commander.
And for those who don't know, most of those cards are the type of effect where if your commander dies, it comes back to the battlefield, and they're instant speed typically.
Yeah.
So someone can remove your commander, and in response, you say, okay, well, next time Shieldred dies, she's hitting the battlefield again. So
Yeah,
it's different.
Totally. But if
kind of
if that
protection,
doesn't
but-
happen, it's dead in your hand. Those kinds of spells do absolutely nothing if your commander's not actively being removed. Whereas like with it, if you have counter spells, let's say you have 2 counter spells in your hand, you can feel really confident using one of those counter spells to mess up your opponent's game plan, and then still have one in your pocket to protect your game plan. So yeah, I hadn't really thought about how easy blue has it on the protection front, where the rest of their interaction package just naturally serves as protection for their game plan as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I really like playing blue. I really like playing blue, and people hate counter spells, and I totally see why. Because I played Mana Drain in a lot of my decks. I went through a phase where I was getting these cool cards and upgrading my decks and started putting them in my decks and didn't realize how much they were actually powering my decks up.
Yep.
Because you cast a Mana Drain on someone's 6 mana spell and they're tapped out, and that feels so bad for them, and it's so good for you, but the amount of bad you feel for how bad you're making them feel often is like, oh shoot, that was not good. But I run a lot in some of my decks. I'm running less and less these days as I'm trying to build a variety of power levels. But in some of my decks, like in Garth, we've talked about my Garth One-Eye deck. That one is a pretty powered deck. That one's powered up pretty highly. I run 7 counter spells, which is not a lot in terms of like a CDH deck, but for casual, 7 is like nothing to sneeze at, especially in a 5-color deck. And
yeah,
but a lot of times when I'm running counter spells is not because I want to be like, screw you and your Finale of Devastation, even though that is a really good fringe benefit because I don't want that to happen. It's often I have my commander.
You've definitely counterspelled my spells like that.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm not gonna not get a good value counterspell, but also like to save me from losing the point of it is not to keep someone from doing something cool. It's to save me from losing the game or being completely out of the game by having my high reliance commander removed, right? And so which feels so bad.
So
yeah,
here's my question.
Bad.
Here's a follow-up question on that. No, I think you're totally right. And so when it comes to a high reliance deck, a deck that is highly reliant on the commander, should you wait to cast your commander until you do have some sort of protection? I was saying, like, I really want to cast Shieldred on turn 3 so I can start doing things. But if I don't have a Feign Death in hand, or if I do have one, but I don't have the mana to cast it the same turn that I cast Shieldred, do you just wait? Do you wait to cast the commander so that you're not like leaving your commander open to removal?
Really good question. I think there are instances, and again, all of these things we're talking about are going to be very tightly woven. But I think there are instances where you kind of risk it for the biscuit. You say, okay, other people want to do stuff on their turn, and I'm going to get my commander out, right? I do think that is significantly easier to do if you have a commander that's mana value 4 or less, right? So you can cast a mana value 4 commander on turn 3. Also depends on turn order, which I don't think, especially in casual, people think about enough. That if you're first in turn order and it's coming around to turn 3 and you say, sweet, I ramped on turn 2, I'm going to play a land, cast my 4 mana commander. Everyone else on their turns wants to do that, right? So depending on their mana value of their commander or whatever, but they want to do, it's still early enough in the game that people are trying to capitalize on their ramp, right? So I think there's room for that. But the flip side of that is I've done that. And I've had Keltsin with 1 blue up hit me with a Pongify before the end step, and then go to his turn, and now my 4 mana commander is 6 mana, right? So it feels bad. Really good play, really smart play, really heads up play. And I should have waited. I should have thought he's holding up that mana for something, and it's going to hurt when he removes my Wilhelt or whatever, or my Cherie or whatever.
I think it's really interesting that you bring up 4 mana as kind of that limit, because it's both the limit of where I feel comfortable playing my commander into potential removal, where I feel like the risk of removal is low enough, but it's also the limit where it becomes very difficult to cast again with commander techs. So 4 is actually like a really weird thing because 6 hurts. 6 mana hurts the second time you have to play a 4 mana commander, but at the same time, it feels low enough risk on turn 3 to do that. So I actually think that's like a really interesting number.
Yeah, that's where in my head it started to solidify as it feels safe. That being said, if you are 4th in turn order and it is turn 3, everyone's about to untap with 4 or with 5 mana on their turn if they've all ramped, right? And that's when things get really dangerous.
That's pretty rough.
And so and I don't think about that nearly often enough when I'm playing casual commander. I think I've been playing CDH recently, and I think turn order has been kind of beaten into my brain because it's something you have to think about pretty actively in CDH, and I'm not particularly good. And I've been barely realizing that after weeks of playing CDH, but I do think it's something you could take into your casual games to not necessarily to improve your win percentage, but to help you have more fun in your games doing what you want your deck to do if your deck relies heavily on your commander. I will say, I feel like that's something that you have learned in playing your Mirim deck, right? There were a couple times I feel like when you were first playing it that you cast Mirim on turn 5, and I was like, okay, and I countered it or something, and it feels bad. Or I had enough. I mean, it has Ward 2, but
counter because it has Ward 2.
It has Ward 2. Yeah, but like it comes back to my turn, and I have a Swords to Plowshares up, and you have no interaction. I can spend 3 mana and remove your commander. I feel like it's so much better to say, okay, I'm gonna wait till, because he costs 5, right? He's 5 mana value 5.
6.
He's 6. Oh, 6 is oof, dude.
Yeah.
6 is big.
It's the worst.
Yeah. So yeah, you wait till you have
that deck is crazy.
Go ahead.
So Mirim is kind of a kill on sight commander because Mirim gets out of hand so quickly. Like I frequently, if I can get Mirim down, then in the next 1 to 2 turns I can potentially like have a look at a win just because like it can get out of hand that quickly. And so I have just had to learn I need to have mana up for interaction because Mirim is going to get removed likely the turn that I play Mirim. And so what I've changed about that deck is as much as I was ramping before for a 6 mana commander, I'm ramping even more now so that like I will have excess mana when I cast Mirim. And then I also run a lot of interaction so that I can protect Mirim. But that was a rough lesson. Like I did have a few games where Mirim got removed 2 or 3 times, and then it's like at 12 mana you just like can't even cast Mirim and expect to do anything.
Yeah, and if you're trying to cast it always on curve, like that's what's going to happen. Is I think here's the order of events: is you played Mirim a couple times and won with Mirim pretty handily a couple times. And the rest of us thought, oh, okay, we need to kill Mirim very quickly. And so you confidently cast Mirim on curve. And the rest of us said, okay, I'm not waiting to spend this interaction until later. I'm spending my turn to remove Mirim because he's probably not gonna be able to cast the next turn. And then you said, okay, well, fine, I'm going to cast Mirim and still have some mana available for some counter spells.
Yeah.
It's
a smart play with decks like that.
Yeah, I do. I think it's worthwhile to, I think, again, 4 mana, probably your limit for risking it for the biscuit. And otherwise, you should probably wait until you've got something to protect your commander. So one thing I did want to cover, though, is we've talked about commanders as being... we've talked about decks being highly reliant on the commander, and we've kind of talked about it in the context of a commander inherently making a deck very reliant upon it, right? So like Muldrotha, like is a commander where inherently it's very like the deck is very reliant on Muldrotha. Wow, I'm having a hard time saying that. But I do think there's potential for decks to be very reliant on the commander, or you can build the deck along a different axis where the commander is enabling the strategy of your deck or enhancing the strategy of your deck, but your deck's not super reliant on your commander. So I think an example of this is I really like Sultai. I've built so many Sultai decks. Sidisi Brood Tyrant is a deck that I play. And what Sidisi Brood Tyrant does is when she enters the battlefield or attacks, you mill 3 cards. And then whenever one or more creature cards are put from your library into your graveyard, you create a zombie. So one way that people build Sidisi is they build it as a zombie kindred deck, right? Where you're creating zombies off of Sidisi, so you're putting in a bunch of zombie staples, and now instead of just your Dimir zombies, you have some Sultai zombies, and it's a very cool Sultai version of the deck. That version of the deck is incredibly reliant on Sidisi, because Sidisi is the one that is incidentally creating all of these zombies as you mill, right? Or as like a self-mill deck, I think, that unless you're building in some other strategies, that can be really reliant on Sidisi. The way I've built Sidisi, and I do think it still has some reliance on the commander, I think that's hard to avoid because that's part of what makes commander fun is that you're building around a commander and a strategy around a commander, right? But the way I built Sidisi is more of a reanimator deck where I have just a bunch of giant creatures, a bunch of creatures that can get stuff out of my graveyard and other reanimation effects. And I'm relying on Sidisi to mill me, but I also have other mill effects in my deck so that I'm not hamstrung if I say, okay, turn 3 Sidisi, go, and Keltsin is like, okay, on your end step, Pongify Sidisi, right? So,
Yep.
I think that is
I got
something
you bad
I've been
with
trying
Pongify,
to do.
didn't I?
You did a couple times. A couple times you've gotten me pretty bad with Pongify. Yeah, it feels not very good.
I love it.
But that's something I've been trying to do more recently because it does feel really bad. And even in games where you're trying to cast your commander and your deck is very reliant on your commander and you don't draw like any of your protection or you don't draw Lightning Greaves or you don't draw Swift Boots, the games where you do feel amazing. But the games where you don't, you're like, oh my gosh, like what do I do? They're going to get removed immediately. Do I just sit on the back burner the whole game and never cast them? So I've been trying to move away from that a little bit and try to make my commanders part of my game plan, but not all of my game plan.
I like that. That's a really good way to look at reliance in commander decks. The third category that we're going to talk about is setup. So how much setup is required before you play your commander? One of the first decks that jumps to my mind in terms of like how I've built decks that require a lot of setup is something like Azuri. So I have an Azuri Claw of Progress deck, and that's the one where you get experience counters when you play creatures with power 2 or less. And then when you move to combat, you get to put a bunch of 1/1 counters on things, and you make those small creatures really big. Very fun deck. Requires, before you play the card, the commander, no setup. There doesn't need to be anything on the battlefield before you play Azuri. In fact, you don't want anything on the battlefield before you play Azuri, right? So you want to play Azuri, but where the setup comes in is in the deck building, right? So it affects the type and amount of cards that you play. So I went through building the deck and said, okay, if I'm going to play Azuri, I need a lot of things that trigger Azuri. So any place where I could replace ramp or card draw or some other effect with a creature that did a similar thing and had power 2 or less, I'm making that swap, right? So setup can mean a couple different things. It can be what's on the board when you play your commander, and it can also just mean like what do you need to have in your hand and in your deck when you play your commander.
Yeah, I do feel like this is something we talked about prior as we were getting ready for this episode that I hadn't really thought about, is that some commanders really do have that setup in the deck building process. It's like the game before the game, right? Which, I mean, obviously you're building your decks, you're having fun building your decks, but it's something to really, really consider is how a lot of what we're talking about with setup, I think, is you think about play patterns. Like with Azuri, the play pattern is you have a bunch of creatures with power 2 or less, or effects that create creatures with power 2 or less, and you don't want to cast any of them until you've gotten Azuri out, right? That is the play pattern, but as part of that is set up as a play pattern, right? So very low setup as part of your play pattern in the deck, but you have to think about it, right? But in your deck building, the setup in the deck building portion is, okay, I don't probably want to run Cultivate or Artifact Ramp or anything like that. I'd rather play Sakura Tribe Elder or Wood Elves or something that will trigger Azuri and also get me lands, right? I do think another consideration of that is that Azuri is for mana value, right? So you could run something like a Nature's Lore or a 3 Visits, which feels good to ramp you towards Azuri. I still think you would prefer a Sakura Tribe Elder or a Dork, because when you draw them later, they're not dead and they're triggering Azuri, right?
Exactly. And like worst case scenario, there's something you can put 1/1 counters on later. So like a Birds of Paradise, which is only a mana dork in the early game, later can be a big flyer, which can come in for damage, and that's pretty awesome. That feels good when you hit someone with the Birds of Paradise for 10 damage. It's it's a good feeling.
No one expects that. No one ever expects the Birds of Paradise for 10 damage. Yeah, I think that's. Go ahead.
Sorry, we're battling the lag here. I was gonna say I do have like other decks where there is a lot of on-board setup that is required, like Corvold. You want to have things on the battlefield that you can sacrifice to Corvold when you play him to immediately start getting value. Ideally, you got a bunch of treasures out. You cast Corvold with your lands, and then you can start sacking treasures to draw cards and really get that engine going. So that's a deck that requires a lot more on-board setup before you actually play the commander.
Yeah, one of my decks that I think actually is on the high end in all 3 of these categories, and as a result can feel very bad to play sometimes, is Shuri, Shizo's Caretaker. It is a mono black deck, costs 5 mana to cast Shuri, and what Shuri does is whenever a creature with power 1 or less dies, if Shuri's still on the battlefield, it comes back, that you control, it comes back to the battlefield. So it basically runs a bunch of useless little creatures that have stupid effects that draw you a card when they die or into the battlefield and are 1/1s. And so it's a fun engine that you can build with Shuri, but it's highly reliant on Shuri, and it costs a lot. I think the main benefit of it is that the setup is before you cast Shuri. That is like the upside here.
Yeah.
Is that you don't cast Shuri and then cast everything else. I'm dumping my hand of all these little creatures, and they're like cantripping sometimes, drawing me cards, which is great. And then I get a sack outlet out there, and then I cast Shuri, and then I sack everything, and it all comes back, and you draw some cards. And I think that is another really good example of onboard setup. And admittedly, a lot of these are sacrifice-based decks, because the ones we've talked about so far. I'm trying to think of an example that isn't sacrifice-based, but I think a good one potentially would be Ishin, Two Heavens is One. I built an Ishin deck that I really hated because it was a very, very poorly constructed budget deck that played around the initiative, and it did not do very well. But Ishin, I think, is a good example of a commander that requires a lot of setup, right? Where you don't want to just cast Ishin on turn 3. You want to wait until you have some things that can attack. Right. Ishin, go. And they're like, okay, Pongify, Ishin. You want to get all your stuff out that has attack triggers and then play Ishin and then swing out, right? You'd much rather do that than just have an Ishin sitting, a lonely Ishin on the battlefield. So, again, another thing to consider, and I do think this is an interesting one because I think Reliance to some degree affects play pattern, but it's really intuitive, and I don't think sometimes that setup is as intuitive in its play pattern and sometimes in its deck building. And I think it's one that people miss out on a lot. Like I think there's a lot of decks where I've said, cool, I'm putting in all of the Talisman and all of the Signets and Soul Ring and Arcane Signet and all of these great artifact ramp spells because that's how you build a commander deck. And then I play the deck and I'm like, why is it not doing what I want? Oh, because I'd much rather have this be a Nature's Lore or a Cultivate that goes into my graveyard because I need to, again, Sultai is what I love to play, and I play a Tasigur deck, and I don't want artifact ramp because I want to play a spell that goes in my graveyard that I can use to delve away to cast Tasigur, right? And that's something to consider when you are building your deck, is the setup, the pre-game setup and the in-game play pattern to set up for your commander.
I love it. I think we've broken that down really well. The thing that we want to talk about next is we want to look at each of the relationships between these. So like, how do cost and reliance affect one another? How do cost and setup affect one another? And then how do reliance and setup affect one another? So in terms of cost and reliance, this is something that you mentioned. You've been wanting to play a lot cheaper commanders, especially when the deck is more commander reliant.
Yeah, primarily because it feels so bad to play a 6-mana commander, get it removed, and then say, okay, well, I'm not doing anything this game. That sucks. So one of the decks. So I've been looking at a lot of 2 and 3 mana value commanders that are in 2 colors, because to me it feels so much better to get your commander out, and then if your deck relies on your commander, then sweet, you can start running. If someone removes it because they're scared of it or whatever, you're like, okay, well, now it costs the same as your commander the next time I play it, and I can do other stuff in between, right? And so I really like that you called out 4 mana value as being like the really the ouchiest spot, the oofiest spot, right?
Yeah. Because if you have something way high, if you've got a 6 mana commander, then you're like, as you're building the deck and as you're playing the deck, you're thinking, wow, this commander's really expensive. I need to make sure it sticks. And 4 is at the point where it's kind of in between. It's like 4 is actually not bad. You can play it on turn 3 most of the time. But all of a sudden, then it becomes a 6 mana commander if someone removes it. So like 4 really is kind of that spot where I think you can have a lot of frustrating games. And as I think about my decks and I think about the 4 mana commanders, I frequently can have frustrating games with 4 mana commanders because I'm not thinking enough about what am I doing before the commander comes out, and how do I make sure that the commander sticks? And it is like a little less intuitive than just having like an 8 mana commander where it's like you gotta play it and you gotta figure out a way to get it to stick. It's a lot. That 4 is a tough spot.
Yeah, and I would say especially if your commander doesn't start doing its thing immediately, right? So
yeah,
like if you are playing a commander that says, okay, I'm going to play my commander on turn 3, and then I need to set everything else up afterwards, and it gets removed, that's when I think it feels especially bad, because then you have to cast it for 6 again. Whereas I do think commanders that you can set up first, if your deck is highly reliant on your commander, I would prefer to have a deck that is highly reliant on my commander and can set up in preparation for my commander than one that is highly reliant on my high mana value commander that says, I'm going to cast my commander first. Please, nobody remove it for an entire turn cycle.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, that's why you politic in commander, right? It's to make people feel bad for removing your 4 mana commander.
I feel no guilt anymore for removing Mirim once it hits the board. It's never working ever again.
I love it.
No, but we played decks with some of our friends. I have a Krenko Mob Boss deck, really fun deck, and I've messed up in that deck a lot by saying, okay, turn 3 Krenko, and then someone removes Krenko, and you're like, oh, right, I didn't have any goblins, and Krenko didn't have haste, so I couldn't do anything. One of our friends plays a Zada, a Hedron Grinder deck, and that one is one that, 4 mana value, but he pilots it, first of all, very well. And he's not just running Zada out on turn 4, right? He's doing the appropriate setup on board and in his hand to be able to cast Zada and then immediately cast something else.
Try and win.
Right, and try and win or generate enough advantage that he doesn't get absolutely blown out. And sometimes he has gotten blown out, right? And it's either because someone does something before his setup is finished, or he's kind of shot off the line too quickly and said, okay, turn 4 Zada, go. And then someone says, okay, Blasphemous Act, I guess, for one.
Yeah.
So,
yep.
And especially because we've learned that Zada is very scary, so we're very wary of when he can cast Zada and do stuff.
It just goes so fast. I mean, it just goes 0 to 100 just so quickly, and that's what makes it, I think, a really fun deck to pilot. A very difficult deck to pilot, but I mean, he does it so well. That's why it's fun to play. Okay, so now let's move on to cost and setup. So how do cost and setup affect one another?
Yeah, so I think we've talked about this to some degree. Like I was saying, Zada is one that requires a lot of setup and is a relatively low cost commander, right? But one thing I want to touch on is the play patterns of this, because I feel like the play pattern for a high cost commander, again, 4 and up, right? 4 mana value and up probably, is pretty intuitive that you want to, okay, I'm going to play my setup pieces early, and I'm going to play my high cost commander later, right? So you do all this stuff, play your commander, profit, right? I do think that the low cost, high setup commander realm is much less intuitive, and I think where people can start to build their deck and pilot their deck, because I think this comes in the deck building and the deck piloting process, right? And pilot their deck and feel bad. And this is one where we talked about one of your decks that you play, which is Magar.
Yep. Magar is kind of a weird one. Probably not a lot of people have seen Magar on the battlefield. It's from Unfinity, and it's Magar, Magus of the Strings. And it's a really weird deck. The commander costs 3 mana, 1 black, red. And then it has an activated ability for 1 black, red. And you note... I'm trying to remember
really weird.
Exile.
You do exile it. I'm sure you do.
Okay, so you note the name of an instant or sorcery in your graveyard, and I think you end up exiling it. I end up just like using the card so that I remember which card it is. But you create a 2/2 that whenever it deals combat damage, you get to cast that instant or sorcery spell for free.
Okay, and here's where the confusion comes in: is you do put it on the battlefield face down, so it's really weird. So everyone knows what it is, and it goes on the battlefield face down. We do it face up because that's the same as noting it and putting it on the battlefield.
Yeah, but then when it dies, it does get exiled.
It does.
It does not go back to the graveyard. So the deck is, first of all, it tries to move very quickly. It is trying to like. It uses a lot of rituals. It's really trying to go pretty fast. It's a combo deck, so there's like a few kind of combos that it's trying to set up with like either infinite combats or things like that with instants and sorceries. So Magar is like a pretty cheap commander. He only costs 3, but you can't play Magar and say go, or else you've done absolutely nothing. And like there's a lot of setup required for Magar to actually work. You need to have something that you want to reanimate in your graveyard. And so frequently the way the deck is set up to play is you spend the first few turns ramping, kind of setting up a board state and trying to get a bunch of cards into your graveyard. You're playing things like Entomb. You're playing a lot of like looting effects to try and get your relevant either high value or combo pieces into the graveyard. And then you only cast Magar once you have like 6 to 9 mana, because in the same turn you want to play Magar and then get something onto the battlefield. Usually you also want to have a haste enabler on the battlefield. I guess that's also part of the setup. But yeah, in my head, Magar is a 6 mana commander. Magar is not a 3 mana commander because I'm playing him for 3 mana and then I'm spending 3 mana to activate him in the same turn. I'm never just going to run Magar out and say go.
Yeah, well, and that's like, and I think that's where it becomes very unintuitive, is that is not a thought that I would have, I guess, unless I'd played the deck a lot, right? As you're building a new commander, it's very hard to say, oh, this commander costs 3, but it really is a 6 mana value commander, right? Because you're trying to cast it, activate its ability. Could be 7 even, right? Cast it, activate its ability, give something haste, and then swing in, right? Again, very unintuitive, and especially if you've never piloted the deck. But
yeah, this is not the kind of deck that I would ever like lend out to somebody if we're like sitting down to play and they don't have a deck. I'm like, yeah, here, why don't you run Magar? It's very weird to pilot just because it isn't really like a whole lot of other decks, and part of that is because the commander is from Unfinity.
Yeah, but I think that is something to like consider is like even with low mana value commanders, you can have a lot of setup required, and you don't want to just play them into an empty board because otherwise you're saying, okay, I would like to cast my commander for 5 mana next turn, please, because someone's going to board wipe and you're not going to get any value. Yep. Or just remove it because they're like, hey, Magar sucks. How about you cast it for 5 on your turn instead of reanimating something and swinging in, right? So I do think an example though of like something that is very low setup, very low cost. We talked about it is Giada Font of Hope, right? Your deck relies on your commander somewhat, right? Because it's an angel deck. Typically, people are building it as an angel kindred deck. When you cast an angel, it enters with an additional +1/+1 counter on it, and Giada is a mana dork that taps for white. And I think you can use it for anything or only to cast angel spells.
Only angels.
Only angels, yeah. So I mean, it relies on the commander, but it's not. But it costs 2 mana, and there's no setup required, right? You'd play turn 2. You run out Giada.
Is the setup.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So there's no setup for casting Giada. Giada is helping set up for the rest of your deck.
Yeah, which is cool.
Very, very
and I
cool.
don't think I have very many decks like that. It's kind of cool to have a mana dork in the command zone because it is just like working as setup for the rest of your deck. It's cool.
Yeah, the one that you had mentioned is actually a card that is banned. It was the first one that came to your mind. We've been talking about the ban list a lot recently, and so Raphelos, is that the name of the card?
Yeah, I think it's Raphelos Llanowar Emissary or something like that. It's green for an elf that taps for 1 green for each forest you control. So it's a mono green commander that on you cast on turn 2 and on turn 3, all of a sudden it ramps you for 3 mana. So you got 6 mana on turn 3 with no additional ramp. It's wild. There's a reason it's banned. It's just like way too good in the command zone. That being said, I want it unbanned because I really want to make like just a big green Raphelos deck that just casts big green stupid stuff. I think that sounds really fun. But
sure, turn 2 Raphelos
like
into
really
turn
cool
6
to try.
Yeah, turn 2 Raphelos into turn 3 Primeval Titan. Right, that's the dream.
Yeah, that's the dream. That's why we play Commander.
Yeah, exactly. To play with those sweet band cards.
Yeah,
I think so. I just wanted to, before we move on to our next one, which is Reliance and Setup together, I wanted to talk about a commander that is like high setup and high cost, which is again the more intuitive play pattern that is reinforced by this, but is Zeatora the Incinerator, which is a Jund deck that is a sacrifice deck, cost 6. When you at your end step, you can sacrifice another creature, and when you do, you deal damage equal to its power to any target, and you create 3 treasures. Right. Super intuitive play pattern. I'm going to play all my creatures out, and then I'm going to play Zeatora once I have 6 mana. And then at my end step, I'm going to sack a creature, deal damage to something, create some treasures, right? I think the thing I want to focus on here is that high setup, low cost is so unintuitive and something that I think people should be thinking about when they're building their commander decks, because it's really... it is a hard thing to spot when you're building your deck, because it's so easy to say, I'm going to power out my commander as fast as possible.
Yep. Yeah, it is. It is of the 4. You in our show notes, you have like a little like grid, a little matrix of like low cost, high cost, low setup, high setup. Of the 4 combinations, that for sure is like the least intuitive and probably least common in terms of deck building, is like low cost but high setup.
Yeah, I guess that's fair. I guess it occurs infrequently, but it can feel really bad if it is the type of deck you're playing and the type of commander you're playing, and you haven't recognized that play pattern, and you just feel like you're just not having any good games, Okay, so let's move on to the next one, Reliance and Setup together. Now, this is a little bit different than the other ones, because a lot of what we've been talking about is how mana cost plays into this, or mana value of your commander plays into Reliance and Setup, but we're not going to be talking about mana value at all here. This is just how reliant your deck is on your commander and how much setup it requires. And I think there are a couple categories and ways for us to think about this, which would be your commander as the payoff for the things you're trying to do with your deck, and then your commander as like an engine or an enabler to things that you're trying to do with your deck. And we're probably going to touch on some of the commanders we've talked about in each of these categories. Do you want to start, Kelton? One of these is a deck that you have and have played.
Yeah, and I mentioned it a little bit earlier. Like Korvold is Commander as a payoff. It requires a lot of setup in that you mostly just want treasure tokens on the battlefield or anything that you can like easily and quickly sacrifice. And then once you cast Corvold as the payoff, then you can use all of that advantage that you've accrued to generate more advantage and profit off of it. And by drawing cards and making a giant creature that you can swing in and deal commander damage with.
And I would argue that most Corvold decks are pretty reliant on their commander as well, right? Like, you're not building a Corvold deck that is like, oh,
bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, it feels bad if Corvold does get removed because you've created a bunch of things to sacrifice, and now you either don't have an outlet, or if you are sacrificing them, you're not getting as much profit or advantage off of sacrificing them as if Corvold was out. So like that is like an example of like both high setup and high reliance.
Yeah, and I think another one of this, and I think actually fits into the category we were just talking about, where it's low cost but actually kind of high setup, is Anhelo the Painter, right? Or Anhelo, I don't know how you pronounce it. I pronounce it Anhelo. Is he costs 3 mana, Grixis, red, black, blue, for those unfamiliar with the shards. And what Anhelos does is you can the first instant or sorcery spell you cast each turn has casualty 2, meaning you can sacrifice a creature with power 2 or greater, and you copy the spell, right? So, it's, in my mind, Anhelo is the payoff for having creatures to sacrifice and instants and sorceries in your hand, right? And as
That's
a result,
a lot to ask.
Right, it's a lot to add. There's a lot of setup, right? A lot of setup in deck building, and then a lot of setup before just running out your commander on turn 3, right? You want to at least have a creature, at least one creature, right, out to be able to sacrifice, and at least one spell in your hand, so that you don't just end up casting your commander and then blanking.
And the mana to play it.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So you don't want to be, even if you get something out turn 2, you don't want to run Anhelo out turn 3, right? At least turn 5, I would say, is probably, or at least when you have 5 mana, is when you want to cast Anhelo, right? Like, for me, I'm thinking of something like, I don't know, even like a Night's Whisper, right? You cast Anhelo and you have 2 mana remaining. Night's Whisper, sacrifice my creature with power 2 or less, and now I'm drawing 4 cards, like, for 2 mana. That's great. That is a great rate. But it did require the setup of having, it's a payoff. It is exactly a payoff. And again, we're talking about this agnostic of cost, right? We're not talking about the mana cost because he's a 3 mana cost commander. But you do need that, like, that's pretty high setup requirements. And the deck relies pretty heavily on Anhelo, or else you're just you might just be spinning your wheels with these instant sorceries that aren't doing as much as you want them to do, or accruing as much advantage as you want.
Totally. The other category that you named was your commander as an engine or enabler. And so this is an example where the setup might be a little less because like your commander is the thing that actually gets it going. It may still be pretty highly reliant. The 2 examples that we had talked about from my decks of engines or enablers are Alila and Azuri, which are both very, very reliant on the commanders for the deck to function. But Alila is a deck where it's an Esper deck, so white, blue, black, and whenever you play an artifact or enchantment spell, whenever you cast an artifact or enchantment spell, you get to create a 1/1 fairy with flying. And so what you want to do is you don't want to play artifacts and enchantments generally until Alila is out, so that you're getting those payoffs. And it really is an engine. So you're playing things that create fairies and hopefully using the fairies to help you play more things. And it's really like you said, an engine. Azuri is the other one. I had mentioned that earlier, that in general, I do want to ramp before I play Azuri so that I can play Azuri earlier. So I will play like Mana Dorks and Sakura Tribe Elder and things like that. But generally, I do try and avoid making a lot of little creatures on the battlefield until after I have Azuri out as the engine or the enabler for the strategy, which is make those small creatures really, really big. Like there's actually really not a lot of other things in the deck that are making those small creatures bigger. It's mostly just Azuri. So very reliant, but in terms of setup, low setup before I get Azuri out, and then I want to play all this stuff. And that's just the way the engine works in the deck.
Like you're playing those dorks in Azuri, and you're forced to play dorks to some degree because you want creatures, like small creatures in the deck for later in the game. But the overarching theme here is that you are not doing anything except for ramping to your commander as fast as possible to then do other stuff afterwards, right? Where like a deck that I'm currently working on is Evelyn the Covetous, which is the same thing. You want to ramp up to Evelyn, cast Evelyn, and then cast vampires to get the top card of opponents' libraries, right? And so it's very reliant on Evelyn, or else you're just casting vampires and not getting any value out of it, right? But just significantly less setup outside of ramping. So two decks I wanted to talk about, or one deck I want to talk about, well, I guess technically two, are things that are maybe that kind of are a gray area in this, like, I don't know, they're kind of nebulous. I don't know where they fit in the reliance versus setup here. And that's AC and Tetiova, which basically are the same deck, right? They're the same deck with just a 1 mana value difference. Whenever a land enters the battlefield, you draw a card, and then AC has the additional benefit if you can play an additional land on your turn. So you have a lot of ramp spells in the deck that are trying to get lands out of your library and onto the battlefield, and you want to cast them to ramp up to your commander, but then you also want to cast them after your commander. So I guess this would still be like pretty high reliance on your commander to like draw the cards and stuff. But the setup is kind of a weird spot because you need, I guess maybe they fit in the engine and enabler category where you're ramping to them. It is just funny to me that those same cards that you're wanting to cast to ramp them are the ones that are also contributing to the strategy of the engine that you want. So I wanted to point those out as potential interesting ones.
That is really interesting. So I've built AC, or at least I'm building AC. It's kind of gone through a couple different iterations, but AC can be the payoff to getting a lot of lands, because then you can make more lands, and then you can draw a bunch of cards, and that is a payoff. But there's actually nothing about AC that wins the game other than just giving you tons of advantage. The way that you're winning the game is by drawing, I guess maybe by drawing the cards. So I've built the deck as kind of like both a landfall and a combo deck, where I am just trying to draw my whole deck. But also, like, there are the common landfall benefits, like Rampaging Balos. It's just like making, or Scute Swarm, that's just making a bunch of things that can win me the game. So yeah, that is a very interesting gray area, and maybe a fun area to build around in. And I think, like you said at the very beginning when we were talking about reliance, and you were saying that commander reliance depends on the way that you build the deck. Maybe that's kind of how these kinds of commanders work too, is like you can build the deck with them as the payoff, or you can build the deck with them as the engine or enabler. There's maybe a couple different ways to build some of those decks.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe the overarching theme for a lot of this conversation, is it really all depends on how you are building your deck, right? Mana value doesn't. Mana value is pretty set in stone. Your commander costs this much, right? But I think they're just really important things to think about it took me a long time to think about when I was building commander decks, and I don't think I'm perfect at it, as evidenced by this conversation that we even, disagree on maybe some aspects of it. But it is really, really important to think about, and sometimes is not very intuitive. So again, let's a quick recap. The things that we want to think about in our deck building, as far as building around our commander, are the cost of our commander. When are we casting it? How restrictive is the mana cost? What types of fixing do we want? What mana value of fixing do we want? Are we looking to play more 1 mana like Dorks and Utopia Sprawl Wild Growth because we're trying to rush our commander out because it's a low mana value commander? Are we playing more Talisman and Signets? Are we going to play a Gilded Lotus, because maybe we have like a 7/8 mana value commander that we just are trying to get as much mana as possible? Or do we want specific color fixing? I hadn't really thought about the mana restrictive. I think that's something that I think about in my deck building, but hadn't considered as part of like the cost. And so I think that's something that's really important to think about. And then number 2 is setup, and how much setup our commander requires. And I like that we split it into 2 paradigms, into setup in terms of play pattern and how we're piloting the deck, and setup in terms of how we're building the deck so the cards we get allow us to set up properly for our commander. And then number 3,
Absolutely.
Yeah, and then number 3 is reliance. How I may have done those in the incorrect order. Number 3 is reliance, how reliant our deck is on our commander, and how much we want to protect our commander if our deck heavily relies on our commander. I don't think I can talk about this one enough. It feels so bad to play a commander that costs 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 mana and have it immediately removed, and have your deck rely so heavily on your commander and have it not be on the battlefield. It sucks. Eminence is really cool because your deck can rely on your commander and it doesn't have to be on the battlefield. I don't play any decks with Eminence, but I think that's what makes it so strong, is your deck can rely on your commander and you don't have to think very critically about when you're casting it, right?
I love it. That's awesome. That's a really good recap, and it's very fun to talk about. And so hopefully, if you're listening, you've gotten some great ideas as to how you can think about your commander decks as you're building them, and maybe have a few new insights to that process. And if you have any other ideas, anything that you think about when you're building your commander deck and you're trying to build around your commander, please let us know. We'd love to hear it. You can reach out to us. You can find us on thecommanderpod.com. There's a way to get in touch with us there. And we release a new episode every week. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And so that is going to be everything from us for this week, and we really hope to see you next week. And until then, remember to always pay the one.